Now that we know how to tell Access to return today's date in the current time, we can use that information to help obtain query results that are relative to today. We have two different functions that return slightly different results, depending on the type of question that we're trying to ask. The dateAdd function will allow us to specify a time frame such as the past 30 days, or within the last year, and return records within that time frame. The dateDiff function will allow us to find how many days have been elapsed between today and a specific event. We'll take a look at how we can use both of those with our employees data. Let's go ahead and create a new query in Design View, and we'll add the employees table. I'll go ahead and close the Show Table window, and then we'll add their employee ID, and I'll scroll down, and we'll grab the hire date. Now, because of the way Access stores dates as serial numbers, we can actually perform some very basic math operations right here. So I'm going to come over here to this third column here and type out the equation hire date minus, and then I want to put in today's date to find out how many days have elapsed since the employee was hired. To do that, I'll just type out the date function, DATE, and then an open parenthesis and a closed parenthesis. When I press enter, Access fills out the expression and it wraps the word hire date inside of square brackets. Let's go ahead and give this an alias that we can understand. I'm going to type in number of days employed. Go ahead and run the query, and we'll see the results. Now this is returning it as a negative value. So this is how many days since they were employed. Let's go ahead and rearrange this a little bit. Let's go back into Design View, and I'm going to come in here. I'm going to actually right-click and say Zoom to give myself some more room. Now instead of hire date minus today, let's rearrange this. I'm going to take the hire date, and I'm going to cut it to the clipboard by pressing Ctrl-X. Let's go ahead and delete the minus sign as well. So we'll go date minus the hire date. Let's go ahead and say OK, and then run this again. Now we're getting a positive number, which looks a little bit better. So we can scroll through here and see how many days each employee has been employed. If we go to the very bottom, we can see the most recent hires, and they've only been employed for a couple of days. Now keep in mind that this calculation is relative to today, the day that I'm recording this movie. When you run it, you're going to get different results here. Let's go back into Design View. So that's a simple math operation that we can do. But what if we wanted to add months or years? Well, for that, we're going to use those functions that I was talking about. Let's go ahead and select this column, and I'm going to press Delete. Then I'm going to right-click and go to Build. That'll open up the Expression Builder, where I can go into my Functions, Built-in Functions, Date and Time, and I'm going to click on the one called dateDiff. dateDiff will calculate how much time has elapsed between two given dates. I'll double-click on it to add that up here at the top. Now, if I look at this hypertext link down here on the bottom, it'll tell me which values are optional. In this case, I can see that first day of week and first week of year are optional components because they're wrapped in the square brackets here. The other ones, the interval, the date 1, and the date 2, are not wrapped in square brackets, so those are all required. I'm going to come up here to the top and delete the references to the optional arguments. Now, the only ones we need to focus on are the interval, the first date, and the second date. The interval is what units we're going to be counting. So for instance, if I put in quotation marks a D, it's telling the dateDiff function that we want to calculate how many days have elapsed. If I wanted to calculate how many months have elapsed, I would use the letter M. And if I wanted to calculate how many years have elapsed, I would actually use 4 Ys. It was slightly different. I'm just going to go back and change this to a single D. So we're going to calculate how many days have elapsed. Now for date 1, I'm going to put in the reference to our hire date. So I'll go into the tables here, employees table, and I'll double click hire date. And now we want to calculate how many days have elapsed between the hire date and today, the same function we did just a moment ago with the minus. Here I'm going to put in the function to calculate today's date, which is just date, open parenthesis, close parenthesis. That'll return today's date. I'm going to press OK, and that adds that down in here to our columns field. Let's go ahead and give this a new name. Again, I'm going to call this days employed. I'll go ahead and run it, and we'll see that we get the same result that we got just a moment ago. Let's go back into Design View. I'm going to expand this open just a little bit so we can see the full equation. Now the power of the dateDiff function is that we can calculate lots of different intervals, not just days. So if I were to change this from a D to an M, we would calculate how many months have elapsed. Let's go ahead and run that. Now we can see how many months since each employee was hired. Go back into Design View. And if I change this to 4 Ys, we'll calculate how many years have elapsed. Let's go ahead and say run. And this is how many years the employees have been with us. Let's go ahead and go back into Design View. So that's the dateDiff function. It calculates the difference between two given days. In this case, we're using a specific hire date that's from our database, and we're calculating that relative to today's date using this date function here. But you can use two dates that are present in your database. For instance, you can calculate the time between a hire date and a termination date to find out how long an employee was with the company. Let's go ahead and change this up a little bit. I'm going to highlight this whole function here, and I'm going to delete it. Let's go back into Design View and take a look at one more. I'm going to go into the builder, and we'll go into the functions, built-in functions, date and time, and this time we're going to look at date add. Date add has 3 requirements: an interval, a number, and a date. The interval is what units we're looking at, whether we're looking at days or months or years. The number is obviously how many days or months or years we want to add or subtract from the date that we give it. So let's go ahead and fill this out. Using the date add function, what we can do is find out a specific date relative to another date. In this case, I want to find out what the day was 90 days ago from today. So in this case, the interval is going to be days. I'll put a D in quotation marks. The number I want to find is -90. And the date that we want to start with is today's date. So I'll type in date, an open parenthesis, and a close parenthesis. Let's go ahead and say OK. And just so we have a reference point, I'm going to come over here into this next column and just type out our date function, an open and a close parenthesis. And I think at the very beginning, I'll give it an alias of today. Let's go ahead and run it. And now we can see what today's date is here. And then we can also see what the date was 90 days ago from today. Again, your results are going to be different because it's going to be based off of the day that you run this example. Let's go ahead and see one more thing that we can do with these dates. I'll go into Design View, and I'm going to clear out both of these fields here. Now let's say that we wanted to find all of the employees that haven't had their 180-day review yet. We can actually use these same functions in the criteria row as well. So what I want to do here is say that I want all the employees with a hire date that's greater than a day that's 180 days ago from today. Let's go ahead and go into the builder to redo this. I'll right-click in this criteria field and choose Build. Here, I'm going to start this function with the greater than symbol, and then we're going to go into our functions, built-in functions, date and time, and then date add. The interval that I want to add is days. So in quotation marks, I'll type in the D. The number is -180. And the date is going to be today's date. So I'll just use the date function to calculate that. Let's go ahead and say OK. And our criteria is populated down here. Let's expand this open so we can see it. So again, we're looking for all the employees whose hire date is greater than a day that's 180 days ago from today. Let's go ahead and run this query. And we can see that I have, at this point in time, 22 employees that haven't been with the company for 180 days yet. So working with dates is an integral part of making sense of all the data within your database. With a little bit of practice and some persistence, mastering the date and time-based data and using it to filter out relevant data will help make your queries that much more successful.